All right, so I have the honor of introducing our two speakers. First is Miljohn Ruperto, who is an LA-based artist born in Manila, the Philippines. He is obviously the subject of the solo exhibition that is happening at both the Cantor Arts Center, Animal, Vegetable, nor Mineral, as well as here at Minnesota Street Project Foundation, Ultimate Days. Miljohn's distinctive multimedia practice considers the elusive nature of knowledge and strives to unsettle our knowledge of nature. Working across film, video, digital animation, performance, photography, and more, Ruperto interrogates the way we conceptualize, categorize, and represent nature to understand our place in the world, chronicle its history, and imagine its future. Ruperto received his MFA from Yale University and BA in art practice from UC Berkeley. Stephanie Syjuco was also born in the Philippines and is currently based in Oakland. She is one of our OG 1999 SF Bay Area awardees, so shout out to that. She works in photography, sculpture, and installation, moving from handmade and craft-inspired mediums to digital editing and archive excavations. Recently, she has focused on how photography and image-based processes are implicated in the construction of exclusionary narratives of history and citizenship. Syjuco received her MFA from Stanford and BFA from the SFAI, San Francisco Art Institute. She's the recipient of Guggenheim Fellowship Award, a Joan Mitchell Painters and Sculptors Award, and a Tiffany Foundation Award. And then, apart from being an artist, she's also a longtime and beloved educator, I might add, as professor of sculpture at UC Berkeley. I hope you'll join me in welcoming both Stephanie and Miljohn to the stage, and also joining them is, of course, Maggie Dethloff, who will be moderating the conversation. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. Just want to echo Bora and Amy in thanking each of the institutions that came together today. Thank you to my Cantor team. Thank you to Artadia team, and thank you to the Minnesota Street Project Foundation team. Really fun to be in such a sort of collaborative mix here, and such a privilege to get to be in conversation with Miljohn and Stephanie. And I have a number of questions prepared because I was encouraged to prepare questions, and it was really fun to think about how these two artists' work are so dissimilar in some ways, but very similar in other ways, and sort of dig into that. And of course, I forgot to actually introduce myself. Maggie Dethloff, Assistant Curator of Photography and New Media at the Cantor Arts Center at Stanford. Let's dive in. All right, so both of you, as was mentioned in your bios, were born in the Philippines, but raised here in the Bay Area. And so I'm curious if you can speak to how that trajectory has influenced your art practice, and also thinking about the fact that we're here in the Bay Area. Has the sort of history of Bay Area art and activism had any particular influence as well?
Please.
Yeah, I think, you know, being raised here, I think, and going to school here, going to Berkeley for college, I think it really situated a kind of, I think just being in it made me fairly political, or the way I thought about things. And also going to Berkeley, I don't know, radicalized me. So I think in terms of, I think everyone I knew were sort of in the same boat, right? And so conversation, so I was just in it. So I didn't even think it was somehow different, you know? Yeah.
But it was really great, right?
Yeah.
I think, so I've been thinking about Miljohn and I in terms of being born in the 70s, coming to the US as young kids, right? So I came in 1979, and I've been thinking a lot about the sort of the other immigrants and other kids that I grew up with at the time. And it was this big mishmash of folks. It was folks from all over. My family didn't necessarily stay with all Filipinos to congregate. So it was this, very open kind of space. And growing up in San Francisco at the time, you were in Burlingame, right? I was in San Francisco. It was a really radical space. For those that remember it from the 70s and the 80s and even into the 90s, there's aspects of it that have kind of disappeared, and we're trying to keep the flames alive in different ways, and new flames have happened. But I think there's a huge Filipino American community in the Bay Area. The good news about that is that it actually just became kind of part of our surroundings. I've heard of others who grew up in other cities where there was a smaller community, and it felt like there was a struggle to have to kind of find that group, but here I felt like it was just around us. And in a way, what that did was, for me, it freed me up to just kind of have an open practice that didn't necessarily center around being Filipino.
So Stephanie, you have work on view in San Francisco right now at the San Francisco Arts Commission Gallery in a show called Dream Jungle, which Matthew Miranda, who's here in the audience, curated. Bravo, Matt. And that work there is the Center for the Study of the Tassidae, which you've characterized as a meta-archive. And of course, you've worked with archives in several of your projects in the past, thinking about questions around who controls historical narratives. And Miljohn, this has been a sort of constant question in your practice as well, and top of mind for me is your series about Isabel Rosario Cooper, an actress, a Filipina actress, perhaps better known for her relationship with General Douglas MacArthur than for her own achievements. So can you each tell us a little bit about your projects that challenge accepted historical narratives, and how do they challenge history as a discipline or practice itself?
I guess the way I think about one of my favorite characters that I kind of like to think about is the anxious historian, right? The historian that's so panicked about their relationship to history and their responsibilities in terms of representation. And so I like thinking about this character, and I think it sort of informs my own relationship to historiography, and and sort of thinking through basically how history is constructed. And I think going back to the first question, I think also living here in the Bay Area, relating to many different types of kids, that I grew up with, there's a kind of acceptance of a kind of different grounds, right? People coming from different places, and I think I developed a kind of skepticism, which sort of coincide with sort of theorizing also in the 90s. So it felt really comfortable for me.
Skepticism around sort of the familiar frameworks?
Yeah, or like a general, frameworks of modernity, like these kinds of things we take for granted. So, my relationship to history is much more tense, I guess. Yeah.
I like that, a tense relationship with history, I think is, I see in both of your practices sort of a germ for this sort of radicalness in your practice, going back to this idea of like art and activism and addressing these sort of historical issues and changing the way that people are relating to those historical moments and even the practice of history. Stephanie, can you tell us a little bit about your archival-based work and especially the work on view at SFAC?
Sure, yeah. So we're lucky to have the wonderful curator, Matthew Miranda, here, who curated Dream Jungle at SFAC. My project there, actually, so I'll back up a little bit. I had the pleasure today of seeing Miljohn's show at the Cantor, and it just really struck me of how research-based it is. So when we use the term archive, there's this kind of idea that, one is kind of plumbing the depths of some kind of historical collection. But in the end, it really is all about trying to kind of connect with, like a history or something that might have been elusive at the time that we're trying to bring forward. And so I was just really, really impressed by the deep research practice you have in that. And so it actually made me feel better about the way that I work, because sometimes I think that when I'm working deep in a kind of like esoteric research-based space, I worry about what's legible to the public. But I think what I saw in Miljohn's work was this kind of bravery of just kind of putting it out there, which I think is really wonderful. And when I think about the piece that I have in Dream Jungle right now, it's a meta-archive. So it's a I don't want to say a fake archive, but it's an entity. It's a collection I made that is out in the world. My name kind of isn't attached to it except as the director of this archive. And it brings together a kind of critical lens of how an indigenous group in the Philippines was kind of positioned as a Stone Age tribe. And the sort of Western kind of scrutiny on it in a way that made it, it pointed out more about how the West sees itself as opposed to what this actual reality of this tribe was. And so, looking at these documents, trying to kind of like pick through and come up with something interesting to say about it 50 years later.
It's fantastic. If you haven't had a chance to go see the show, go see the show soon. So, yeah. Miljohn?
Yeah. I mean, I've become more and more interested in this kind of reaching, right? And what that means, and what is that impulse or inclination, especially in terms of kind of a diasporic discourse. Yeah. It's still up in the air, I guess. But I think it's really interesting to think about that longing, or, if it's the same as a kind of longing in terms of the discipline, also the discipline of history, like reaching towards a kind of object or event or truth.
Connection, trying to find yourself somehow maybe like in the space.
Yeah, and it's kind of, I don't know, I'm curious about how different this diasporic longing and this for connection, and this other side of it, which is this longing for like a kind of continuity in history as well. Yeah.
This reminds me too, Miljohn, of your ongoing project, The Great Disappointment, which is like quite research-based, quite sort of history-looking. There's one of the works on view here, Ultimate Days, is part of that greater project, thinking about the 19th century religious sect, the Millerites, and their sort of failed apocalypse that they imagined. That work also is thinking a lot about sort of desire in that case sort of for the end of history, for the apocalypse, for something new that comes after it, which is a spot that I want to bring us back to in a little bit, thinking about sort of the future and futures. But that project is also sort of very rooted in thinking about Hudson River School visual codes and what the landscape genre can do, how it functions ideologically as well as an artistic medium. And this reminded me, Stephanie, of your project at the Wadsworth, which I was thrilled to see visiting family in Connecticut, where you were also thinking about the Hudson River School painting and thinking about 19th century ideology reflected in the landscape. So I'm curious how you both see landscape functioning within your broader considerations of sort of history and power, reflecting these sorts of desires or anxieties. And I'm curious, how do you think the landscape genre can open itself up ideologically or even turn around and center, if not visually, conceptually, the people who have been disenfranchised or decentered from that landscape itself?
I think a lot about aspirational things, or what that even means, right? And this sort of longing I'm interested in, with the Millerites longing for a kind of end, I thought was really interesting. And when it didn't come, then it became known as the Great Disappointment, right? Like there was this crisis that happened. But the thing is, when we think about the Millerites, we think about this failed apocalypse, but at the same time, there are multiple apocalypses were happening around, around them. It's just, we just aren't looking, at those instead, right? And so I think, for me, the way it ties to the Hudson River School is that, I really think what's nice about landscape painting and sort of its history sort of connected to the sublime, right? To reaching out also to the sublime, sort of the dreams of also, it's also a kind of art dream, or aspiration to sort of depict or, be in touch with the world, basically, And so when you reach out for the sublime, there's this funny thing that happens where it sort of maps out your own ontology, right? And that for me is really interesting. And for me, that's my interest in this invention of the sublime, right? Because it maps out basically the West's ideals and values, and it's self-map. It maps itself, which is, I think, or in this automatic way, which I think is really interesting. Yeah.
Reflects back a lot of our values and desires, as you said. And previously I've heard you talk about how the Hudson River School, Thomas Cole was responding to industrialization. And so depicting these sort of pristine, sublime landscapes is a sort of nostalgic response in a way of grasping onto something that's already disappearing, which I think is fascinating.
Yeah, there's already, it's already a fiction, right? Like a kind of fantasy already of, it's funny because there's takes on Thomas Cole in being, being a naturalist or whatever, but it's more interesting in that he created these fantasies that became, we talked earlier today, it became sort of the container for this fantasy of infinite extraction and, like the push towards the West, like westward expansion and manifest destiny, all these sort of fantasies I think you could see in because you think that Thomas Cole is responding to industrialization, and so somehow that makes him a naturalist, but yeah. It became also just a kind of map for a manifest destiny, and the expansion of industrialization all the way through the United States.
Yeah, power is so much more complicated than just like this against this.
Yeah. Well, I was thinking too, so again, bringing it back to your show, but 19th century American painting, if you consider the time, right, imagine you don't see that many images like that in the 19th century. You come across a painting, it's as awe-inspiring and kind of crazy. It's like a VR thing, really. It's this depiction of this kind of fantasy landscape that kind of mirrors the landscape you might see outside, but has kind of, put it on steroids into this fantastical world. And yet we're also, as we're trained both as young children and also as young artists, we're trained to look at these landscape paintings as if they're a kind of precedence of our reality. They're sort of foundational. And so when I became interested in 19th century American landscape, I would tell people that, and they were like, why? Why is that so interesting to you? And I said, well, because it's kind of our inheritance. It's like if we grow up in the United States, these are the vehicles of visuals and the way we're supposed to see the world, and it's really a foundational thing. And so once you can start to kind of pick apart some of those odd choices within that genre, then you can start to pick apart a lot of how American history itself is constructed.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, too, the sort of the American West in that scenario, too, becomes a little bit of a, what's that word, synecdoche, the part that stands for the whole, and the way that our visual, the visual production of the American West that speaks to those greater ideas of what the country is as a whole. It's really telling. And of course, because we're here, in the West, that seems especially sort of deeply rooted here, and comes back to, the earlier question of thinking about the character of the Bay Area as being so deeply intertwined with art and activism. Gives me a little bit of hope for the future that we can keep pushing against these traditions that may not be serving us so well. We've talked a lot about history, but I want to get us to the future, so I wonder if we can talk a little bit about the present. What is keeping you both up at night these days in terms of current issues? How do you see your work, or maybe ideas for future work, relating to that present moment? Do you see your work as sort of acts of resistance in a way?
What keeps me up at night? I guess it's just I'm really into time and temporality, and just thinking through what that means. I think in terms of, during COVID, I wrote this paper, and it's called An Operational Account of Western Spatial Temporality. And it's sort of a serious but jokey paper where I sum up Western ontology in 5 pages. And so it's sort of like this project of having the West delimit itself, right? So that's sort of where I'm coming from, and to create like a kind of tool to do that. That was the purpose of the paper. But the paper, in writing the paper, it really made me think about, engaging with basic things, like time and space, and how much we're biased, right? How much we take a lot of things for granted in thinking about those things, how time works, And I think Western time or Western ontology is so totalizing. But, what are the ways where we can create tools to delimit itself? And so one of the ways I think about what keeps me up at night is just thinking through, I guess, recently I've been thinking a lot about time and contingency, which is my favorite word, or concept, as a way for a kind of way to open or break things up, right? I'm gonna just say this hot take. So I think entrenched power dominates space, but it doesn't dominate time, right? The only way it can dominate time is if we all are convinced that the main engine of time is causality, or So when we become determinists, then we sort of play into becoming conduits of entrenched power, right? But, and we think, okay, so the way I think we think about time right now is that it's mostly causal or determinist, and then there's 10% contingent, right, accidents, but we have to control for that also, right? But this already shows you like how obsessed we are in being in control, in controlling things, right? So this is something I've been thinking about.
Yeah, and sort of if you buy into the sort of assumption that capitalism or any of these sorts of like structures of power will continue, that is how they end up continuing, right? You have to buy in and believe in it or think that it's an inevitability in order for them to sort of reproduce themselves into the future. Right?
Yeah, and what's nice about contingency is no one knows,
Yeah, so the uncertainty can be productive.
Yeah.
Yeah. That was not quite the sort of current issue I was thinking of, but I think it underlies all the current issues, thinking about like a sense of inevitability and the way we can combat that. So thank you for that more generative answer. Yeah, Stephanie, what's keeping you up at night?
Ooh, yeah, that's a big question, right? What's keeping everyone up that night? I think, in broad strokes, I think it's what keeps me up at night is the notion of disappearance. So disappearance in many ways, disappearances of histories, disappearances in our lived realities, disappearance in a kind of expansive way we see ourselves and our communities. So that, yeah, is an overarching thing. And I think when I'm thinking about making work right now, because wasn't part two the question, like, what's urgent or what's...
How do you see your work relating to the present moment? Do you see your art making as a form of resistance?
Oh, boy, yeah. Okay, so, I think if I were to take that word, I think there's two types of resistance. I think there's the resistance that's on the outside, the visible resistance, the thing in which we can point to and kind of say, oh, that's where I see something happening to try to affect something else. And then I think there's also an invisible kind of resistance in which those of us who might not be able to wear out on our sleeves how we work to platform or to kind of create these other spaces of access or to keep things alive, right? And so right now, I think my problem, and I'd be curious if you think this right now too, is I'm making work right now that I don't think I can show because I don't think it's actually a receptive time to show it, but I'm thinking that maybe in 5 to 10 years, it will have a receptive audience.
I think that's important to make work for the future. And, earlier we were chatting about somebody needs to do this work and sort of speak up, but even if there isn't a moment to show it right now, it's the moment to make it, and that itself is very important.
Maybe it's even hopeful to think that in 5 to 10 years there will be an audience for it.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, again, it's hard to project even like 10 months ago or a year ago, right, that we would be where we are now. So imagine, what does it look like? What does the audience look like 5 years from now? What does the art world or, whatever, what do artists, what are they encouraged to make 5 years from now, and what are they discouraged from making?
Yeah, I like to think, think through this question, I guess, by thinking about also like what we want, and how we're trying to build new futures or realities, and I think, we're talking earlier when you're describing this work, and I thought, yeah, I'm for it. One way, I guess, I think about that made me feel better about present time is that I I like to think about things in terms of two worlds, right? The world we inherited and the world we're trying to bring forth, right? And it sort of helps me, be patient or be, to think about it in those terms because, I think a lot of times even, people on the left or whatever, they're like, we're fighting, we're fighting in between those worlds, right? There's a kind of misunderstanding that if you're not working, let's say, within the world that we inherited, then it's fruitless, it's pointless, right? But then, we have to imagine new futures or new possibilities, right? And we have to sort of coalesce around those. I mean, that's what reality making is, right? That's what meaning making is. It requires people to sort of, sort of cohere into to a space or to an ideology or a new future, a new reality. Yeah.
Yeah, I think also when I was walking through your show earlier today, because it's like it spans about 15 years worth of work, and some of the earlier works I remember it was like, oh, that was done, in 2015, and I was like, okay, well, what was happening then? How is it timely now? That wasn't that long ago, but it's still, just thinking about that and also thinking about how now I feel like there's a lot of ways in which we're revisiting artworks made decades ago to kind of see if we can create these like understandings or threads of whatever we can pull forward in terms of either like a resistant vision or what was their vision of the future like 100 years ago. And that maybe I've been thinking a lot too about timeliness, that back to the idea of time, that timeliness in an artwork sometimes isn't when the work was necessarily made because it might not even be legible, but maybe the next generation all of a sudden something has clicked kind of, community-wise or political-wise to actually start to see some of the things that were happening in the work. So, that's an interesting kind of time travel, too.
Yeah. My other favorite thing to think about recently is luck, where there's a kind of situational consonance, and that sounds lucky, right? Like when a work resonates and it's sort of contingency that brings it forth, and it's a surprise, and yeah.
And this reminds me, Miljohn, of the other work that you have on view here at Minnesota Street Project Foundation, The New Society, which I was supposed to plug earlier because at 6:45 it will have its once daily screening. We hope you will all stay for it. It's a really fantastic piece. But in that work, you are thinking about sort of what we leave behind and what we want to take into the future. And so I wanted to ask, and so this dovetails really nicely, sort of, what is the role of, I was thinking about it in terms of archives. What is the role of archives for the present and for the future? But I think we could switch that and just say, what is the role of art and making art now in the present? Something like, what is what you want to send into the future, knowing that that might be the moment where it's most meaningful is sometime in the future. So I'm just curious if you have anything more to add on that idea.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, what's amazing about art and engaging with art is a kind of rethinking of your relationship to an object or an idea or the work itself, right? Like it's always demanding a new way of engagement, right? When I teach, I talk to my students about, being an artist, you kind of learn to apprehend opaque things, right? And to come up with strategies to read something maybe you've never seen before, right? How does that work, you know? And I think that that demand for leaping into, in a way, you kind of have to change to be able to engage with a work. Sometimes you don't know how to change, you know? Yeah, and I think it should be practiced more often. I think that this is something that's kind of relegated to artistic production or artists. Like artists do it all the time, but I think, you know, like I want artistic thinking or like the attitude of in making to sort of proliferate into other disciplines or to other worlds, you know? I think artistic thinking really contributes greatly to general thinking. And I'm always thinking about that. And I always think about also when, you know, like when I encounter an artwork, I'm training myself to sort of see how it fits in the world, right? Like how, like my responsibility would be sort of to suture together a kind of future or bringing forth a kind of reality, you know, that's a collection of sutured strategies, right?
That's speaking of looking at artwork and trying to create new connections too. So I had a very profound moment today with Rodin's The Gates of Hell at Stanford, and I was shocked because I've seen that many, many times. I mean, it's kind of almost like a, you know, it's one of those artworks where you just sort of quickly dismiss after you've sort of, you know, gotten out of high school. And then, but I looked at it today. I was sitting at Stanford, and I was looking at it, and I was like, wow, gates of hell. You know, and thinking, we're there now. And I just remember I was kind of surprised. I was like, wait a second, this thing that I just have always, you know, I used to bike by it all the time at Stanford. I've seen pictures of it, we all kind of understand it. I had a different connection to it today just because of what my brain, you know, was going through and just because it was there. And it was kind of amazing, actually. So I sort of surprised myself with that. And then it made me feel more hopeful about this making artwork that at some point you sort of, you trust that you're gonna hurdle it forward into the future. Maybe it lands with a thud, you know, and nobody sees it or whatever. And maybe in the future it connects with somebody in some way that you had no idea, you know, would happen. So that idea of the luck, the timeliness, the, not quite the archive, but that historical thing that then becomes reimagined or maybe re-socialized with in a different way, you know, I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah. One of the things that I've loved most about working at Stanford is I feel like in the arts at Stanford, we think about artists as leaders. They are our best researchers, our most sort of forward-looking, you know, public figures. And so in a lot of ways, this thinking about your work or looking back at other people's works and seeing how they land differently in the future and reveal something about the present moment, I think is the sort of one of the most important things to recognize, that art has this power. It is future looking in that way, which is really fantastic and leads me to my last question that I had before we open it up for Q&A. What is one thing, this could be an event, a value, a structure, really anything, that you want to see in the future or see more of in the future? And we've already sort of touched on this, but how do you see art being able to help shape that future you want to see?
Yeah, I think a really important component in art, or the whole art thing, is learning how to read. You know, like sort of figuring out strategies to be able to engage with artworks. And I think my hope for the future is that, there's more sort of self-reflexivity. The way artists are obsessed with like artists are really good at, are thinking through the ground, right? They're really good at challenging the ground. They're constantly thinking about it. And I think this is a really healthy attitude, like a general sort of responsible way of being in the world, And I think that's what art can offer to everyone else.
I think what I want to see more in the world is a time and a moment where there are certain, I think, times when artists are called upon to somehow alleviate or address what's happening in society. There's always that, pressure, right? Okay, if you don't see the work being made that's political or that, addresses this specific thing, then there's something wrong. And so we do, I think, bear some burden of that to be, responsive, timely, on point, politically accurate, that kind of thing. And I get it. I think, of course, we have an important role to play on that. But I also really hope for a future in which we're at some point able to not have to be so responsive and can be much more proactive about creating those futures without the pressure of having to fix the present.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for joining me in conversation. This was very generative for me. I hope everyone really enjoyed it. Thank you again to everybody for coming, and please join us in the screening gallery in 2 minutes for the New Society.